In our last topic, we saw that we want to help our physical and spiritual children learn to understand the various kinds of death so they can learn to explain to others how to have spiritual life. That is the good news that Christ has come to offer. In our topic today, we will learn about the planting of the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 2, verses 8 through 9, we read, "The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for you, the tree of life in the midst, and also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Here we see that God also took special care to plant a garden as the place for man to live. This garden was the area called Eden. The word Eden means pleasure. This is the place God created for mankind to live, and also so he could come down there and enjoy fellowship with Adam and Eve. Since it was untouched by sin, it was more beautiful than any garden or park developed since the time of Adam and Eve sinned. Next, we see that God caused every kind of tree in the garden to grow in various parts of the world today. There are many different kinds of trees. However, the Garden of Eden had all the different kinds of trees in the same garden. We see that God describes those trees in two ways. God says the trees were pleasant to the sight. Here, we see the original trees were trees of great beauty. In addition, the trees in the garden were also good for food, as they provided many different kinds of fruit. In nearly every place where anyone lives on the earth, they still have the opportunity to enjoy some of their trees and their fruit. This is one of the blessings that God has continued to supply throughout the earth, even though some trees may not be as beautiful as they were in the garden. We also see that the garden contained two special trees, the first of which was the tree of life, which was placed in the middle of the garden. The tree of life is described in Revelation 22, verse 2, where we read, "In the middle of its streets, and on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." Here, we see that the tree of life in the future will yield 12 different kinds of fruit, a new kind of fruit every month. The same thing is probably true for the original tree of life that God placed in the center of the Garden of Eden. Once Adam sinned, God had to prevent mankind from eating this tree because it would have caused man to live with the consequences of sin forever. Genesis 3 verse 22 says, "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and also take the tree of life and eat and live forever." The second tree that was unique to the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis 2 verse 17, God said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Here we see that God placed one tree in the garden that gave Adam and Eve a choice. They could choose to avoid eating it and they would live forever. In contrast, they could choose to disobey God and experience immediate death that day. We will see that Adam and Eve did experience spiritual death, separation from God, as soon as they ate the fruit of that tree. Genesis 3 verse 7 through 8 says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together to make themselves coverings. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden." Here we see the first example of the fact that wrong choices can have eternal consequences. Genesis 2 verses 10 through 14 goes on to say, "Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 riverheads. The name of the first is Pishon. It was the first of which that skirts the whole land of Havilah, where the gold is. And the gold of the land is good. Bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the first of which that goes around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. It is the one which goes towards the east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. The word translated 'went out of' means to go or to come out of a place and to go to another place. This meant that the river started in the garden and went to various areas. This was probably a giant spring where a large amount of water was continuously coming up from the earth. The giant spring caused so much water to come out of the earth that it made 4 rivers. These rivers flowed in various directions. The name of the first river was called Pishon, which means increase. Pishon went around the whole edge of the land of Havilah, we see that Havilah was known for three things. The land had a lot of gold, and we are told that the gold of the land was good. This means that it was high quality gold. The land also has two other items. Bdellium is a wonderful smelling gum that comes from a tree. It is used to make perfumes that have a good smell. We also see that the area had a lot of onyx stones. Onyx stones are very beautiful and are often used to make jewelry. Larger pieces can often be cut and used like marble to show their beauty. The name of the second river is the Gihon, which means bursting forth. It went around the whole land of Cush, which is modern-day Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, rapid. The river is better known as Tigris. It went toward the east of Assyria. The fourth river is called the Euphrates, which means fruitfulness. The garden and all these rivers were dramatically changed at the time of the flood. Genesis 7 verse 11 says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken open, and the windows of heaven were opened. Before the flood, waters of the rivers came from the inside of the earth." When these fountains of the deep were broken open, it created many changes throughout the entire earth. So it is probable that the way the earth looked before the flood is not the same that it looks today. We go on to see that God gave Adam instructions about the care of the Garden of Eden. Genesis 2 verse 15 through 17 says, "Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day that you eat it you shall surely die." God put Adam in this beautiful garden and told him to tend and keep it. The word translated tend means to work. The word translated keep means to take care of. Here we see that God gave Adam responsibilities for the garden. Work and responsibility were enjoyable before sin came into the world. Genesis 3 verse 17b through 19 tells us that the consequences of sin changed the work, so it became difficult. Those verses say, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat on your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." This curse on the ground made work something that required toil. The word translated toil means pain, labor, and hardship. These things were not a part of the world before sin. God gave Adam instructions about the freedom he had and the one thing he was not to do. God told Adam that he could freely eat any tree in the garden except the one tree. This meant that Adam was free to eat the fruit of hundreds of trees. In fact, there was only one tree of which he was told to avoid the fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was nearly total liberty, as there was only one thing mankind could not do. When, as we became Christians, we have this liberty and freedom restored. Galatians 5 verse 1 says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage." Then Galatians 5 verse 13 adds, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." By giving Adam these instructions, there was only one thing that Adam could do to disobey God. This chapter shows us that God created the ideal place for Adam to live. He was free to do almost anything he chose to do. He was free to obey or to disobey. The choice to obey had only been blessing to offer. The choice to disobey had a very serious consequence: immediate spiritual death. It would also cause physical death at a later time. That is why God told Adam not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told Adam that the day he ate of the tree of fruit and evil, he would surely die. This meant that Adam had been given a clear explanation of the consequences of eating the fruit of the tree. 1 Timothy 2 verse 14 says, "And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression." Here we see that Adam was not deceived when he ate the fruit. He had been told the exact consequences and chose to eat the fruit anyway. God gave Adam the freedom of choice. However, that freedom led to the decision to sin. James 1, verse 14 through 15 says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full growth, brings forth death." God warned Adam about the consequences of the choice before he made the choice to sin. We want to help our physical and spiritual children learn to understand why it is important to explain to others the consequences of the choices they will make. In that way, they learn to follow the examples of the Lord by helping others understand that the choices lead to consequences. May the Lord richly bless you as you help your children learn to understand and explain the consequences of sinful choices.